The Kessler Valley sat in the low country of southwestern Kansas like a cupped hand holding water, and every autumn since anyone could remember, that hand had been filled to overflowing with wheat and milo and soybeans rippling gold and bronze in the October wind. The farms pressed up against each other like pages in an old Bible. The Hendersons on the North Ridge, the Pruitt brothers splitting 400 acres along the creek bottom, old Ray Stoddard running corn where his father had run corn before him, and a dozen others whose family names appeared on the same county plat maps their grandfathers had drawn up back when Kansas was still learning what it meant to be a state. It was a good valley. It had always been a good valley. The soil was dark and generous, the kind of ground that gave back 3 times what you put into it if you treated it right and didn't ask too much too fast. The old-timers knew this. They had grown up learning it on their knees, literally, pressing their fingers into the dirt the way their fathers had shown them, reading the moisture and the texture and the color the way some men read a newspaper. But in the autumn of 1985, something had gone very wrong in the Kessler Valley, and in 10,000 valleys like it across the plains of America. The wheat was standing ready in the fields. The beans hung heavy and fat on their stalks. The milo heads had gone a deep, burnished red that meant perfect maturity. The harvest was there, all of it, every bushel that had been planted with sweat and hope and the quiet desperation that every farmer knows in his chest from the first week of March until the last week of October. The harvest was there, but the machines to bring it in were gone. The radio in Arthur Meitner's kitchen had been playing Paul Harvey every morning since 1962, and on the morning of October 7, 1985, Paul Harvey's voice came out of that old Zenith AM radio, like a man reading from the Book of Lamentations. The Federal Reserve's interest rates. The farm debt crisis spreading across the Midwest like a slow-moving fire. Foreclosures up 40% from the year before. A family in Iowa, 3 generations on the same ground, walking away from everything because the numbers simply didn't add up anymore and never would. Arthur sat at his kitchen table and drank his coffee and listened, and his face did not change. He was 54 years old, Arthur Meitner, and he had the kind of face that had been weathered into something almost geological. The deep lines around his eyes, the permanent squint from years of reading weather across an open horizon, the jaw that seemed to have been carved from the same limestone that poked through the topsoil on the back 40. He was not a tall man, nor a particularly impressive one to look at. He wore the same canvas work coat he had worn for 11 years, washed so many times that the original brown had faded to something close to the color of winter wheat stubble. His hands were enormous, out of proportion to the rest of him, a farmer's hands, scored with old cuts and permanently darkened in the creases with grease and engine oil that no amount of lava soap would ever fully remove. His wife, Dottie, stood at the stove making eggs, and she listened to Paul Harvey too, though she kept her back to the radio, as if not looking at it might make the news less true. "The Pruitts got their notice last week," she said, without turning around. "I know," Arthur said. "Both of them. Dale and Gerald both." She cracked an egg against the edge of the cast-iron skillet, the same skillet her mother had used in the same kitchen when it had been her mother's house. "They just bought that new John Deere. $60-some thousand. "I know," Arthur said again. He picked up his coffee cup. Outside the kitchen window, the October sky was the color of old pewter, and the cottonwoods along the fence line had gone yellow and were starting to let go of their leaves in the slow, resigned way that always made Arthur think of a man emptying his pockets before a long trip. The beans in the south field stood motionless in the still morning air. He had 160 acres of soybeans ready to come out, and another 120 of milo, and 100 acres of winter wheat that needed to go in before the end of the month. He had a lot of work to do. He finished his coffee, set the cup down carefully, the way he did everything, carefully, precisely, without waste of motion, and pushed back his chair. "Eggs are ready," Dottie said. "I know," he said, and sat back down. They had called him Slow Arthur since he was a boy, though not with any particular meanness in the early years. It was simply what he was, slow to speak, slow to react, slow to change his mind once he had made it up. While the other boys in the Kessler Valley were loud and fast and competitive in the way of farm boys everywhere, Arthur Meitner moved through his days like a man who had calculated exactly how much energy was available to him and had decided not to waste a single unit of it. His father, Gus Meitner, had understood this about his youngest son in a way that most people didn't. Gus had been a machinist before he was a farmer, having spent 3 years at a factory in Wichita before the Depression pushed him back to the land. And he had passed on to Arthur not just the farm itself, but a machinist's understanding of how things worked. How a machine was, at its heart, a set of logical relationships between moving parts. And if you understood those relationships, truly understood them, not just knew them, but felt them the way a musician feels the intervals between notes, then no machine was beyond your ability to diagnose, repair, or improve. Arthur had absorbed this knowledge the way the valley soil absorbed rain, quietly, completely, without drama. By the time he was 12, he could tear down and reassemble a Minneapolis Moline tractor engine with nothing more than basic hand tools and a parts diagram. By 16, he was the unofficial repair mechanic for half the farms in the valley, cycling from one neighbor's place to another on his bicycle with a toolbox bungee corded to the rear rack, fixing what needed fixing and never asking for more than lunch and a glass of iced tea in return. He had not gone to college. This was, in those years and in that place, not the statement of defeat that it might seem today. College was for boys who weren't going to farm, and Arthur Meitner was going to farm. He had known this the way he knew the smell of rain coming in from the southwest, not as a decision, but as a simple fact of existence, as certain as the direction the creek ran. He came back to the farm after high school, married Dorothy Klassen in 1958 at the First Lutheran Church in Meade, and together they began the work that both their families had always done, which was to take seed and ground and water and turn them, by an alchemy that never stopped being remarkable, into food. He was not rich, Arthur Meitner. He had never been rich. But through 30 years of careful, methodical farming, buying used equipment when he needed equipment, fixing it himself when it broke, selling at the right times, never overextending, never borrowing more than he could see his way clear to paying back, he had managed to stay ahead of the kind of slow disaster that was now consuming the valley around him. His neighbors had not been so careful. You have to understand the intoxication of the late 1970s to understand what happened to the farms of the Kessler Valley in the early 1980s. The grain embargo of 1980 had hurt, yes, but in the years before that, the farm economy had been on a run that seemed, to those living inside it, to be simply the natural order of things restored to its proper state. Land prices had tripled in some parts of Kansas between 1972 and 1980. The dollar had been weak and grain prices had been strong, and the Soviet Union had been buying American wheat by the shipload. And if you were a farmer in those years, and you didn't feel like God himself was finally smiling down on what your grandfather had started and your father had continued, then you simply weren't paying attention. And the machines. Lord, the machines. The big implement dealers had set up shop in every county seat across the plains, and they came with financing packages that seemed almost impossibly generous. Low down payments, deferred interest, balloon payments so far in the future they might as well have been science fiction. The new combines were something out of a dream. The John Deere 7720, the Case 2388, the International Harvester 1480. They were enormous, gleaming, powerful machines with cabs that had air conditioning and AM/FM stereo, and tinted glass and ergonomic seats, and they could cut through a field at a pace that would have seemed miraculous to any farmer who had grown up behind a horse. They were computerized, or beginning to be. They had digital readouts for grain loss monitoring and header height control and moisture sensing. And sitting inside one of them in the late afternoon, with the air conditioning running and the radio playing Merle Haggard, and the header cutting a clean 16-foot swath through a stand of perfect beans, you could almost believe that farming had finally, definitively, permanently turned the corner from the grinding poverty of the old days into something resembling prosperity. Dale Pruitt had bought a new Case combine in 1979 for $42,000. By 1982, emboldened by strong yields and the continuing advice of his lender, he had traded up to a John Deere 6600, $68,000, financed at 17.5%. His brother Gerald had done the same. Ray Stoddard, who had never bought a new piece of equipment in his life until 1981, had gotten himself a gleaming red International Harvester and a bank loan to go with it at a rate his father would have considered criminal and which Ray, in his optimism, had considered perfectly manageable. They were not stupid men, any of them. They were farmers, which is to say they were some of the most practically intelligent people in America. But they had been caught up in something larger than individual intelligence, a tide of cheap credit and rising land values and commodity prices that seemed to point in only one direction. And when that tide turned, it turned with a violence that swept away everything in its path. By 1983, interest rates had climbed to levels that would have seemed like a fever dream 2 years earlier. Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve was wringing inflation out of the American economy the hard way, and the hard way meant prime rates above 20% and farm loan rates that followed close behind. The land values that had justified all those loans began to fall, first slowly, then with gathering speed. The Soviet grain embargo had cut into export markets. The dollar had strengthened, making American grain expensive for foreign buyers. The whole structure of assumptions on which the farm debt of the late 70s had been built began to crumble, slowly at first, then faster, then in great crashing avalanches of foreclosure notices and sheriff sales and bank padlock machinery. Arthur Meitner had watched all of this from a careful distance, the way a man watches a neighbor's barn burn, with genuine sympathy and a private, complicated gratitude that it was not his barn. He had not bought the new machines. He had not taken the big loans. He had not tripled his acreage or planted from fence line to fence line. He had, in fact, done something that had made his neighbors shake their heads in the boom years and earned him the updated version of his old nickname. No longer Slow Arthur the Quiet Kid, but Slow Arthur the man who didn't know a good deal when it was right in front of him. While Dale Pruitt and Gerald Pruitt and Ray Stoddard and the others were financing gleaming new combines at 17%, Arthur Meitner had been doing something that seemed, in the prosperity of the late 70s, almost perversely old-fashioned. He had been buying junk. Earl Bodine ran the salvage yard outside of Coldwater, which was the nearest town of any size to the Kessler Valley, and he and Arthur Meitner had been friends since boyhood in the particular way of men who recognize in each other a similar relationship to machinery, not as things to be owned and shown off, but as things to be understood and used. Earl's place was 37 acres of organized chaos, if you knew how to read the organization, which Arthur did. The farm equipment section occupied the back 2 acres, behind the car wrecks and the appliances and the scrap steel, and it was there that Arthur spent his Saturday mornings when the season allowed, walking the rows of dead and dying machines with the same methodical attention that another man might give to a used bookstore or an antique market. He was not looking for new. He was not looking for impressive. He was looking for salvageable, which is a different thing entirely and requires a different kind of eye. In the spring of 1982, on one of those Saturday mornings, Arthur had found the first one. It was sitting at the back of Earl's equipment row, half hidden behind a disassembled grain bin and what appeared to be the chassis of a 1950s-era corn picker. It was a 1966 Gleaner Model C combine, Alice Chalmers made, aluminum-bodied, self-propelled, its once bright metal surface gone to a dull galvanized silver gray from years of sitting outdoors. The engine was seized. The header was bent on the left side where something, probably another machine or possibly a fence post, had hit it hard. The reel was missing 2 of its 6 bats. The grain auger had a crack in the housing that had been repaired at some point with what appeared to be a combination of J.B. Weld and genuine optimism. Arthur had stood in front of that machine for a long time, the way he stood in front of everything. Not moving, not rushing, just looking, his eyes traveling over every surface and every component with the systematic patience of a doctor doing a physical examination. He could hear the story of the machine in the way certain things were worn and other things were not. He could see the original quality underneath the damage and the neglect. The Gleaner was, to his eyes, essentially sound. He had bought it from Earl for $380. Dottie had not said anything when he brought it home on the borrowed trailer. She had learned, over 27 years of marriage, that there were certain types of silence from Arthur that meant I know what I'm doing and I'd rather not have to explain it right now. And this was one of those silences. She had gone back inside and made lunch and trusted him. Over the following winter, in the evenings after the farm work was done and the boys were doing their homework at the kitchen table, Arthur had gone into the machine shed and begun the restoration. He worked by the light of a portable trouble light that he moved from one end of the machine to the other as the work progressed, its single bare bulb throwing hard shadows into the corners of the shed and making the whole project look, to his son Jimmy, who sometimes watched from the doorway, like some kind of surgery. Arthur had, over the course of that winter and the following spring, replaced the main drive belts, all 7 of them, sourced from a combination of Earl's parts inventory and a farm supply catalog. He had freed the seized engine with penetrating oil and patience, and eventually, when oil alone was not enough, with the careful application of a bore hone that he had borrowed from the auto parts store in Coldwater. He had straightened the header with a hydraulic press that he had built himself from plans in an old farm journal. He had replaced the missing reel bats with lumber from the scrap pile and galvanized hardware from the farm store. He had resealed the cracked auger housing with proper epoxy and reinforced it with a steel patch that he had cut and drilled and welded himself. When he was done, the machine ran. Not perfectly. There was still a slight wobble in the main cylinder that he hadn't been able to fully address, and the cab, such as it was, offered essentially no protection from rain, but it ran. It would cut grain. It would separate straw from kernels. It would auger the grain into the hopper, and the hopper would hold it. It would do what a combine was supposed to do. His neighbors, when they heard about it, were politely dismissive. Ray Stoddard had driven by on his way to the elevator one afternoon and stopped to look at the old Gleaner sitting in Arthur's equipment lot, and the expression on his face had been the particular combination of sympathy and superiority that prosperous people adopt when looking at the things that less prosperous people are reduced to. "You gonna run that thing?" Ray had asked. "Plan to," Arthur said. Ray had nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone tells you they plan to drive from Kansas to California on a single tank of gas. "Well," he said, "I guess it'll work." He had driven off in his pickup, a new Chevy Silverado, its chrome glinting in the afternoon sun. Arthur had watched him go, then gone back to adjusting the cylinder clearance on the Gleaner. He had found the second one the following year, in the summer of 1983, at a farm auction outside of Liberal. It was a 1966 Gleaner F, the larger model, 12-foot header to the C's 10-foot, and in somewhat better condition than the first one, having spent its declining years in a machine shed rather than in the open air. The owner, a widow selling off her late husband's equipment, had priced it at $400 and seemed genuinely relieved when Arthur didn't try to talk her down. The F needed new bearings in the main drive shaft, a replacement for the worn stone trap, and extensive work on the grain elevator chain, which had stretched to the point of being functionally useless. Arthur had done all of this over the winter of 1983 to 84, his breath steaming in the cold of the machine shed, his youngest son Tommy, 17 years old, quick with his hands in the way Arthur himself had once been, working alongside him on the evenings he didn't have basketball practice. The third Gleaner had come to him in a more roundabout way. He had not found it himself, but had gotten a call from Earl Bodine in the spring of 1984, telling him that a machine had come in that Arthur ought to see before Earl sold it for parts. It was a 1966 Gleaner C, same as the first one, but this one had a history. It had spent its working life on a farm in the Oklahoma Panhandle, cutting wheat in country that was harder and drier and more unforgiving than anything in the Kessler Valley. The previous owner had maintained it with the methodical devotion of a man who understood that the machine was the difference between keeping his farm and losing it, and the evidence of this was everywhere on the machine in the form of careful, correct repairs, properly torqued fasteners, and bearing surfaces that had been greased on schedule for the better part of 20 years. The machine needed very little. New belts. They always needed new belts, and a cylinder grate that had cracked in one section. The reel was perfect. The engine ran strong. The auger was tight. Arthur had paid Earl $475 for it and hauled it home on the trailer and put it in the second machine shed, which was not really large enough for 2 combines and the miscellaneous equipment that was already in it. And Dottie had looked at the arrangement of machinery and said, carefully, "That's 3 now, Arthur." "Yes," he said. "We only have 1 farm." "Yes," he said. She had looked at him for a moment, then gone back inside. In 30 years of marriage, she had learned to trust those silences. By the late summer of 1985, Arthur Meitner had 3 1966 Gleaner combines in running condition, stored in his machine sheds, serviced, and ready. The total cost of all 3 machines had been just under $1,200. The total cost of the repairs and replacement parts, accumulated over 3 years of winter evenings and spare Saturday mornings, had been perhaps another $800. $2,000, more or less, for a complete combining operation. He had not told his neighbors about this. There had been no occasion to, and Arthur was not the kind of man who talked about what he owned or what he planned to do with it. He simply had the machines, and he knew what they could do, and that was enough. The man from the bank was named Whitfield, Gerald Whitfield, Assistant Vice President of Agricultural Lending at the First National Bank of Coldwater, and he was 34 years old with a business degree from the University of Kansas and soft hands and a way of saying difficult things in the pleasant, even tone of a man who has practiced saying difficult things in a mirror. He drove a company car, a 1984 Ford LTD, dark blue, and he arrived at farms across the Kessler Valley that August and September with the same polite knock on the door, the same pleasant expression, and the same folder of documents that amounted to the same message delivered in different quantities of legal language. The bank would be exercising its right to repossess the collateral described in the attached schedule. The collateral was the machines. It happened on a Tuesday morning in mid-September that most of the valley would remember for the rest of their lives. Whitfield had arranged it carefully, with the quiet logistical competence of a man executing a complex operation. There were flatbed trucks, 4 of them, big commercial rigs with hydraulic ramps, and they moved through the valley in a convoy, stopping at farm after farm. At each stop, Whitfield would knock on the door and hand over his paperwork and wait while the farmer read it, and the farmer's wife stood in the doorway behind him, and the farmer's face went through a series of expressions that were painful to see even from a distance. And then the trucks would back up to the machine shed, and the chains would come out, and the big, gleaming, still nearly new combines. The John Deere 6600 with its $48,000 price tag, the case with its 17% interest coupon still attached somewhere in a bank file, the IH with its air conditioning that had worked perfectly for 4 seasons, would be dragged out into the September sunlight and loaded onto the flatbeds like prisoners of war. Gerald Pruitt had actually sat down on the ground in front of his combine when the truck tried to approach. He had sat down in the dirt in his work clothes, a man in his mid-40s who had farmed this ground for 20 years and who had made one terrible decision and was now watching the consequence of it being loaded onto a trailer. Whitfield had waited at a respectful distance, his folder under his arm, his face arranged in its expression of professional sympathy, until Gerald's brother Dale came out of the house and helped Gerald up from the ground and walked him inside. Then the truck backed up, and the chains went on, and the combine went away. Arthur had driven by later that afternoon on his way to the elevator. He had a truck of beans to sell, the first of the season's test load, and he had seen the empty machine shed with its doors standing open and the rectangle of cleaner concrete floor where the combine had stood, and the marks in the gravel of the yard where the truck's tires had been. He had driven on without stopping, though he made a mental note to stop by in the evening and see how Gerald was doing. There were no combines left in the Kessler Valley except on 3 or 4 farms whose owners had, by luck or design, avoided the worst of the debt spiral. And of those farms, 2 had combines that were themselves too old and worn to be reliable, a mid-70s International that Ray Stoddard had kept as a backup and which blew a main bearing at least once every season, and a Massey Ferguson that the Henderson boy had inherited from his uncle and which had not run since 1981. The valley had its grain standing in the fields and nothing to cut it with. 2 weeks after the repossessions, at the counter of Vera's Diner in Coldwater, which was where the farmers of the valley had always gone to drink bad coffee and talk about the things that mattered, Gerald Whitfield made the mistake of saying what he was thinking out loud in a room that was too small for the words. He had come in with another man from the bank, younger even than he was, and they had taken a booth near the window and ordered coffee and pie, and they had talked in the not-quite quiet way of men who are confident enough of their position that they don't feel the need to whisper. What Whitfield said, and several people in Vera's that morning heard him say it, and the story traveled through the valley faster than a grass fire, was this: the timing is actually quite favorable for us. If the crops can't be harvested, the land values drop another 15 to 20%, and we can move on the secured parcels at a price that makes the whole portfolio work out. His companion had said something that wasn't audible. Whitfield had laughed, a short, dry laugh, and said, "Nobody's going to be harvesting anything in that valley this year. We made sure of that." Vera Hutchins, who had owned the diner since 1971 and who had heard a lot of things at her counter, set down the coffee pot she was holding with enough force to rattle the cups on their hooks and looked at Gerald Whitfield with an expression that he would later describe, in private, as unnerving. She did not say anything. She was not a woman who needed to speak to communicate clearly. Whitfield had finished his pie and left a correct tip and walked out to his blue LTD and driven away. By the time Arthur Meitner heard the story from Dale Pruitt, who had gotten it from his wife, who had been in Vera's when it happened, he had already been thinking about what needed to happen next. But the story clarified something. It moved the situation from the abstract into the specific. It changed the question from whether to when. He went home and called his sons. Jimmy Meitner was 26 years old and had been farming with his father since dropping out of the agriculture program at Kansas State after his sophomore year, not because the academics were hard, but because the classrooms were too far from the fields. He had his father's hands and his father's economy of motion, but where Arthur kept his thoughts entirely to himself. Jimmy had a habit of talking through problems that had occasionally made his father look at him with the patient expression of a man waiting for the relevant part of a long speech. Tommy Meitner was 22, 2 inches taller than his brother, and had his mother's easier manner with people. He had graduated high school in 1981 and spent 2 years working at the equipment dealership in Coldwater, not selling, but in the shop, which is where his father had told him to work if he was going to work there, because the shop was where you learned what the machines actually did, and the sales floor was where you learned what people could be made to believe about the machines. He had come back to the farm in 1983 and spent the past 2 years working with Arthur and learning things that no shop class had ever taught. Both boys lived on the farm. Jimmy in the apartment above the machine shed that Arthur had built when Jimmy came back from K-State, Tommy in his childhood room in the farmhouse. Neither of them had been fully told about Arthur's long-range reasoning, if reasoning was even the right word, since Arthur was not a man who made grand plans so much as a man who made preparations and then waited for the moment when the preparations became relevant. The moment had come. Arthur called them both into the kitchen on the evening after he heard about Whitfield's comments at Vera's diner. Dottie was at the table too, her hands around a coffee cup. The radio was on, a talk program out of Wichita, something about the interest rate situation, and Arthur reached over and turned it off. He told them what he was thinking. The telling took about 4 minutes, which was a long time for Arthur. He explained about the 3 Gleaners, though both boys already knew about them, had in fact worked on them, though neither had entirely understood the strategic reasoning. He explained about the weather forecast, which he had been watching carefully for the past week, and which was showing the first frost warning of the season arriving within 10 days, possibly sooner. He explained about the valley's fields, which farms had grain in, what condition the crops were in, roughly how many acres were involved. He had been observing all of this with the systematic attention he gave to everything, storing the information in his memory the way he stored tools in his shed, each piece in its place, ready to be retrieved when needed. When he was done, he looked at his 2 sons. Jimmy looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at Jimmy. "You've been planning this all along," Jimmy said. It was not an accusation. Arthur thought about this for a moment. "I've been getting ready," he said. "There's a difference." Tommy laughed, which broke the tension in the room. 3 combines, he said. 3 drivers. He looked at his father. "Who gets the F?" "I do," Arthur said. "You 2 take the C's. We're going to need to time the unloading rotations, and I'll need to concentrate." Dottie got up and refilled the coffee cups without being asked. Outside, the October wind had come up and was making the cottonwoods talk in their particular October voice. A dry, papery whisper that Arthur had heard every October of his life, and which meant, unmistakably, that summer was over and the real work was about to begin. "What about the neighbors?" Jimmy asked. "What about Dale and Gerald and the rest of them?" "We'll do our own fields first," Arthur said. "Then we'll see." He picked up his coffee. The conversation was over. October was moving fast. The frost warning that Arthur had been watching in the Weather Service forecasts, he subscribed to a twice-weekly printed forecast from the State Extension Service, had for years, and read it with the same careful attention he gave to a repair manual, was now showing a hard freeze possible within 6 days, with a secondary system behind it that could bring real damage. He spent 3 days going over the combines one more time. Not because he thought they needed it. He had serviced all 3 thoroughly in August, when the season was still theoretical, but because 3 days of preparation was 3 days less likely to see a breakdown in the field at the wrong moment. He replaced the cylinder drive belt on the first C as a precaution, even though the old one looked serviceable. He adjusted the concave clearance on all 3 machines and verified the cylinder speed settings. He greased every fitting. There were 17 grease points on each Gleaner, and he had made a habit over the years of knowing each one by location and feel, the way a pianist knows the keyboard. He checked the auger seals, the elevator chains, the straw walkers, the chaffer and sieve settings. Tommy worked alongside him on the second day, and they moved through the machines together without much conversation. Tommy handing tools and holding things and occasionally suggesting an adjustment. Arthur listening when the suggestion was worth listening to and not responding when it was not. A system of communication that Tommy had grown up inside of and understood without needing it explained. On the evening before they planned to start, Arthur walked his soybean fields alone at dusk. He did this every season, a walk through the fields in the last light, an accounting, a kind of communion with the ground and what it had done that year. The beans were excellent. Moisture was right around 13%, which he knew from the test samples he'd been taking all week. They were ready. They had been ready for several days, and every day they stayed in the field past peak maturity was a day's worth of risk, pod shatter, weather damage, the slow diminishment of something that had been brought to its fullest expression of value. He stood at the south end of the south field and looked across the 160 acres of standing soybeans in the gray last light of October, and for a moment he felt the thing that he almost never allowed himself to feel, a simple, uncomplicated pride in what the ground had done and what he had done to help it do it. Then he went inside and went to bed. He was up at 4:30, which was when he was always up during harvest. Dottie was up too, and the smell of coffee and bacon came down the hallway of the farmhouse and mixed with the October morning in a way that Arthur had been smelling every harvest morning of his adult life, and which still, even now, even after 30 years, meant something to him that he couldn't have put words to and didn't try to. Jimmy was at the table when Arthur came into the kitchen, already dressed, his hands around his own coffee cup, his eyes clear in the way of young men who sleep well because their consciences are uncomplicated. Tommy came down 5 minutes later, pulling on a sweatshirt, his hair still rough from sleep. They ate breakfast, bacon and eggs and toast and coffee. Dottie sat at the table with them. Nobody talked much. The radio was on, low, a country station out of Dodge City, playing Merle Haggard's Kern River in the dark of the early morning, which was a song about loss and water and hard country, and which seemed, that particular morning, to be addressing a number of things at once. By 5:30 they were in the machine shed. Arthur had rigged temporary lights. He had run a 300-foot extension cord from the shed's outlet and added 2 drop lights at the far end. And in the bright artificial light the 3 Gleaners looked, to his eyes, exactly like what they were, old, functional, ready. He had backed them out of the shed the evening before and lined them up in the equipment lot, facing west toward the south field, which is where they would start. In the pre-dawn darkness, their aluminum bodies caught the security light's glow and threw it back as a soft, diffused silver, and for a moment all 3 of them, Arthur, Jimmy, Tommy, stood and looked at the machines without speaking. "They don't look like junk to me," Tommy said quietly. Arthur said nothing. He walked to the F, climbed the ladder, and settled himself into the seat. The seat was not cushioned. There had been a cushion once, but it had disintegrated years ago, and Arthur had replaced it with a piece of foam rubber cut from an old camping pad and covered with a square of canvas that Dottie had sewn to fit. But it was familiar, and the controls were familiar, and the view from the cab in the pre-dawn gray was exactly what it should be. He turned the key. The engine turned over twice, then caught, then settled into a rough idle that smoothed as the oil came up to temperature. He listened to the engine for a moment, hearing things in its note that no gauge could measure. On his left, he heard Jimmy's C start. On his right, 30 seconds later, Tommy's C. 3 engines. 3 machines. The sound of them together in the morning dark was a sound that Arthur Meitner, in 40 years of farming, had never heard before, and it was one of the finest sounds he had ever heard. He released the parking brake and drove to the field. What happened in the Kessler Valley over the next 4 days was the kind of thing that stories are made from, though most of the people who were part of it would have described it, afterward, in the matter-of-fact language of people who had work to do and did it. Arthur started on his own beans, as planned, running the F down the south field as the sun came up over the eastern ridge and threw long, flat shadows across the standing crop. The header cut a 12-foot swath, and the beans went up the feeder house and into the cylinder and came out the back clean, the straw laid down in a tidy windrow, the grain full and round in the hopper. He had the header height set precisely. He had checked it 3 times the night before, and the combine moved through the field with the steady, purposeful rhythm of a machine doing what it was built to do. Jimmy was on the north side of the same field, and Tommy had taken his machine around to the back 40 to start on the Milo. They had worked out the logistics in the kitchen 2 nights before, which fields first, where to position the grain cart, how to time the hopper-to-cart transfers to minimize the time any machine spent standing still. Arthur had drawn it on a piece of paper with a pencil, the way his father had taught him to think through any complex operation, and the paper was in the breast pocket of his canvas coat. Word got out. Of course, the way word always gets out in a small farming community where the distances between houses are short and the radio reception is good. By mid-morning, Dale Pruitt was standing at the fence line between his field and the Meitner South field, watching the 3 old Gleaners work with an expression on his face that Arthur noticed without commenting on when he made his turn at the end of a pass. By noon, Gerald Pruitt's wife had brought a covered dish to Dottie at the farmhouse, and Dottie had put it in the kitchen along with 3 other covered dishes that had already appeared that morning, because the women of the valley had their own communication network and it operated at least as efficiently as the men's. Gerald Pruitt himself appeared at Arthur's machine at 2 o'clock, standing in the field and waving him down. Arthur cut the engine and leaned out of the cab. "You've got 3 machines," Gerald said. He was not asking. "Yes," Arthur said. "My beans." Gerald's voice was level, but there was something behind it that Arthur recognized, the controlled quality of a man keeping himself together by main force. "They're going to split the pods if they don't come out in the next few days. And with the frost." "I know," Arthur said. There was a pause. "Tonight," Arthur said. "We'll work your ground tonight. Can your boys drive a grain cart?" Gerald nodded, and something in his face changed. The controlled quality eased slightly, replaced by something that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but was made of both of those things. "Tonight," he said. Arthur started the engine and went back to work. They ran the machines at night. This was the decision that Arthur had not discussed with his sons in advance, but which had been, he was fairly certain, inevitable from the beginning. The frost was coming and the fields were ready, and there were acres to cover and 3 machines capable of covering them. And the arithmetic of all this was simple and did not change simply because the sun went down. He had mounted work lights on all 3 combines during his August service, a pair of sealed beam lights on the front of each header, and 2 more on the cab roof of each machine, rigged from a set of tractor lights he had picked up at Earl's for almost nothing. They were not elegant, these lights, but they worked, throwing a clean white beam across the rows ahead and making the standing grain look, in the darkness, like a corridor of gold. The Pruitt brothers had a grain wagon and a 1972 Ford tractor that still ran. The bank had no interest in a 14-year-old tractor, and Gerald and Dale took turns running the wagon between the field and the elevator, which Myron Carney had agreed to keep open until midnight and then open again at 5 in the morning, because Myron had been running that elevator for 30 years and understood what was at stake. They worked the Pruitt beans that first night and into the following day, and while they were working the Pruitt's ground, Dottie had been on the telephone. She had a gift for organization that Arthur had always relied on without ever drawing specific attention to, which was itself a kind of gift, coordinating with the other farm wives of the valley about whose fields would come next, and who had grain carts, and who needed to borrow one, and who could provide meals, and at what times. By the second day, the operation had grown. Ray Stoddard's son had come over with his father's old grain cart. The Henderson boy had shown up with a tractor and an offer to run shuttle for whoever needed him. 2 of the Pruitt nephews who had been laid off from their own farming work and were now on a construction job in Liberal had driven home overnight and were there at dawn with their hands ready, willing to do whatever needed doing. The valley had come to itself. Not dramatically, not with speeches or declarations, but in the practical, unsentimental way of farming people who understood that when the work needed to be done and one man had the means to do it, you showed up with whatever you had and you helped. You brought food. You ran the grain cart. You kept the fuel tanks on the combines topped off. You did the job that was in front of you, because that was what you did, and that was all there was to say about it. The 3 silver Gleaners moved from field to field across the Kessler Valley. Their engines ran steady and their cylinders turned and their hoppers filled, and their elevators lifted grain, and their straw walkers laid the residue down clean, hour after hour, day into night and night into day, without drama and without complaint, doing what simple, honest machines do when they have been properly built and properly maintained and properly used. The frost arrived on the third night. Arthur felt it coming before the thermometer confirmed it. A change in the air quality, a sharpening, the particular cold that comes off a clear sky with no cloud cover to hold the day's warmth. He was 3 passes from finishing the last of the Henderson soybeans when he felt it, and he did not slow down. He kept the header cutting, kept the cylinder turning, kept the auger running the grain to the hopper. His hands on the controls were steady. His eyes were on the rows ahead. Jimmy was a quarter-mile south, finishing the last corner of the Stoddard field. The F's cab had no heater. There had been an original heater, but it had not functioned since Arthur acquired the machine, and he had not repaired it because he had not had occasion to need it before, and the cold came in through the gaps in the cab panels and settled into Arthur's coat and his fingers and the back of his neck. He barely noticed. He had been cold before. He had been cold many times in fields, in October, in the dark, and the cold was simply another element of the work, like the noise and the dust and the diesel exhaust, to be ignored while the work was being done. He finished the last pass across the Henderson field at 2:17 in the morning. He could see frost beginning to silver the tops of the grain wagon that Dale Pruitt was running the last load of beans back toward the elevator, and on the windshield of his own truck parked at the field edge. He shut off the Gleaners header and sat for a moment in the stopped machine, listening to the engine idle, watching his breath come out in small clouds that the work light caught and turned pale silver. The Henderson field was done. The Stoddard field was done. The Pruitt beans were done, and the Pruitt Milo would come tomorrow in the warming of the day, and the wheat ground that needed to be prepped for winter planting could wait another week if it had to. All the beans in the valley were in. Arthur Meitner climbed down from the F's cab, his joints stiff from 60 hours of nearly continuous operation, his back telling him things he was not particularly interested in hearing. He walked across the harvested field in the frosted dark, and the cut bean stubble was stiff and silver-coated under his boots, and somewhere in the darkness Jimmy had shut down his machine too and was walking toward him, and from the south he could hear Tommy's engine idling down. They met at the field's edge. In the security light from the Henderson barn, their breath made 3 separate clouds that drifted together in the still night air. "The frost is here," Tommy said. "Yes," Arthur said. Jimmy was looking at the harvested field behind them, the rows of cut stubble going on in the darkness as far as the light reached. He had his father's face in moments of satisfaction, still, quiet, not showing much, but the eyes saying something that the mouth didn't need to. "That's all of it," he said. Arthur looked at the field. Then he looked at the sky, which was very clear and very full of stars in the way of a hard frost night, every star sharp and close in the frozen air. "Almost all of it," he said. "We've still got our own Milo." Tommy laughed, then stopped himself, then laughed again. They went to find the grain cart to bring in the last load. Gerald Whitfield drove into the Kessler Valley on the morning of October 14th with a different agenda than usual. The frost had come through 2 nights before. He had read the weather reports, and by his calculations, the standing grain in the valley should now be damaged, the pod shatter and freeze damage reducing the crop value significantly. This would, in turn, justify the additional write-down of the land parcels that the bank had been moving toward, which would in turn allow the acquisition of those parcels at prices that made the whole troubled portfolio, if not profitable, at least recoverable. He drove the blue LTD down the county road that ran through the center of the valley, and he was not prepared for what he saw. Empty fields. Everywhere he looked, the Pruitt ground, the Stoddard field, the Henderson acreage along the creek. The beans were out. The Milo was cut. The stubble lay flat and silver-frosted in the October morning light, clean and uniform. The rows of a completed harvest spread across the valley floor as far as he could see. He pulled off the road and sat for a long moment, looking at a field that should, by his calculations, have been standing full of damaged, unsalvageable soybeans. He drove on and found the same thing at the next farm and the next. Full grain bins. He could see them, the steel cylinders standing in farmyards, and empty fields, and the marks in the field margins where machines had turned, and the chaff and straw waste along the fence lines that was the signature of a completed harvest. The valley looked, in the October morning light, precisely as it should look at the end of a good and completed harvest season. Finished, quiet, resting, done. He drove to the elevator. Myron Carney was in his office, and he looked up when Whitfield came in with an expression of the particular neutrality that people reserve for those they fundamentally dislike, but are too professional to say so directly. Busy week? Whitfield asked. Busiest I've seen in years, Myron said. The Meitner farm. Those old combines. Myron looked at him without any particular expression. They work night and day, he said. 3 machines. Arthur and his boys, and I don't know how many neighbors helping with the carts. Brought in everything. Every bushel in the valley, as best I can figure. Whitfield stood in the elevator office for a moment. He used 1966 Gleaners, Whitfield said. His voice had a quality in it that was hard to read. Somewhere between professional assessment and something more personal, something that might, in another kind of man, have been closer to admiration. That's what they were, Myron said. Old machines. Worked fine. He paused deliberately, the way a man pauses when he has something else to say and wants to give it proper room. Of course, now the farmers have something to sell, which means they have income, which I understand has some implications for your situation. Myron said this last sentence in the completely neutral tone of a man making a purely factual observation, and Whitfield nodded once, his jaw tight, and walked back out to his car. He sat in the LTD for a long time before he started the engine. Arthur Meitner was in his machine shed when Jimmy came in to tell him about Whitfield's drive through the valley, which Dale Pruitt had seen from his kitchen window and reported along the valley's communication network with considerable speed. Arthur was replacing the cylinder drive belt on the F, not because it had failed, but because the tension had been slightly off for the last 20 hours of operation, and he wanted to have it right before he put the machine away for the season. He listened to what Jimmy said without stopping his work. Dale thinks the bank is going to back off, Jimmy said. With the income from the harvest, most of the farmers can make at least a partial payment. Enough to show good faith. The attorney in town says it changes the picture considerably. Arthur said nothing for a moment. He was threading the belt over the drive sheave with the particular hand placement that he had developed over years of working in the confined space of the Gleaners drive compartment. It was a 2-hand operation that required threading the belt between 2 rollers while maintaining tension, and it required concentration. Good, he said, when the belt was seated. He stepped back and looked at the belt routing, checking the tracking with the patient eye of long practice. The neighbors have been asking, Jimmy continued, about next year, whether you'd be willing to do a custom-cut arrangement. Use the Gleaners on their ground, charge by the acre, help them manage until they can get their own equipment sorted out. Arthur picked up a grease gun from the shelf and moved to the fitting on the cylinder shaft. I'll think about it, he said. Dad, Jimmy said, and his voice had changed slightly. It had the quality of a man preparing to say something he had been holding for a while. You knew. You've been knowing this was coming for years, haven't you? The whole thing with the Gleaners. The cheap machines. The keeping yourself out of debt. You knew the whole time that something like this was going to happen. Arthur pumped the grease gun 3 times and watched the grease come to the fitting. I knew things work in cycles, he said. And I knew that when a machine breaks down, it breaks down. New or old. And I knew that if I had machines that were simple enough to fix when they broke down, I'd be better off than if I had machines that were too complicated to fix. He moved to the next fitting. There's a reason these old Gleaners have 17 grease points, he said. It means there are 17 things you can keep maintained with nothing but a grease gun and the willingness to do it. A man knows what he needs to maintain. He can maintain it. A man doesn't know what the computer is doing. He shrugged. A small, economical movement. He just hopes. Jimmy was quiet for a moment. You sound like Grandpa Gus, he said. Arthur put the grease gun back on the shelf. He looked at the 3 Gleaners lined up in the shed, the 2 C's and the F, their aluminum sides dusty from the harvest, their headers carrying the residue of 3,000 acres of hard and honest work. Your Grandpa Gus, Arthur said, was the smartest man I've ever known, and he never paid more for a machine than what he absolutely had to. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands. Get those bearing caps torqued on the 2nd C before dark, he said. I want both machines fully put away by tomorrow. Jimmy got the torque wrench and went to work. 2 weeks after the harvest, Arthur Meitner sat at the counter at Vera's diner and drank coffee and ate apple pie that Vera Hutchins had made that morning and which was, in Arthur's considered opinion, the best pie he had eaten in several years. The diner was busy. It was, if Arthur was being honest with himself, busier than he had seen it in some time, and the quality of the conversation in the booths and along the counter was different from what it had been in the dark weeks of September. There was less of the stunned, exhausted quality that financial disaster creates in people, and more of the ordinary, somewhat complaining conversation of farmers at the end of a completed harvest season, which is a tone that contains its own kind of satisfaction. Underneath the complaints, it was the sound of people who had come through something and were still standing, and it had a quality that Arthur had always loved without ever being able to name. Dale Pruitt was in the booth behind Arthur, telling someone about the old Gleaners, and his description of them had acquired, in the 2 weeks since the harvest, certain embellishments that Arthur chose not to correct. In Dale's telling, the machines had run for 5 days without stopping and without a single mechanical failure, which was not quite true. The elevator chain on Tommy's C had jumped its sprocket on the second afternoon and cost them 40 minutes. But Arthur understood that a story needed some simplification to travel well, and that the 40-minute delay was not the point of the story, and the machines were. Ray Stoddard had stopped by the farm the previous week and stood in the shed and looked at the 3 Gleaners for a long time without saying much, which Arthur appreciated. Then he had asked, quietly, if Arthur would be willing to sell one of them. Arthur had said he'd think about it, which was not no. He was on his second cup of coffee when Vera refilled it and leaned on the counter and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been wanting to ask something and has been waiting for the right moment. Gerald Whitfield hasn't been in since October, she said. I know, Arthur said. I heard the bank is in some kind of internal review over the whole repossession situation. The farmers who made partial payments after the harvest, the bank has to work with them now. That's what the attorney is saying. That's what I heard too, Arthur said. Vera looked at him for a moment with the direct, unsentimental look of a woman who has known someone since they were children together in the same school. You did a good thing, she said. What you did for this valley. Arthur looked down at his coffee. I did what needed doing, he said. That's all. Arthur. She had the license of old friendship. You could have let them go. You could have run your own harvest and let the rest of it happen the way Whitfield wanted it to. You'd have been fine. Your ground would have been fine. Arthur thought about this. He thought about his father, Gus Meitner, who had been a machinist in Wichita and come back to the land, and about his grandfather before that, who had broken the original ground of the Meitner place with a 2-bottom plow behind a pair of horses named Ernest and Claude, and about all the years and all the seasons and all the work that had made this valley what it was. Not just the Meitner ground, but all of it, every farm, every family, every generation that had put its hands into this particular dirt and asked it for what it could give. No, he said, after a moment. I wouldn't have been fine. Not if I'd watched it happen and done nothing. He drank his coffee. Outside the diner window, the Kessler Valley in late October was brown and finished, the fields lying open to the sky, the grain bins full, the farmsteads sitting quiet in the gray afternoon light. It was the look of a valley that had been harvested, that had given what it had to give for another year and was resting now in the earned peace of completion. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone completely bare, their branches making a dark, complicated script against the pale sky, and Arthur watched them for a moment through the window glass and thought about the next season, which would come as it always came, with its own complications and its own demands, and which would require, as it always required, that you know your ground and know your machines and keep your debts small enough that you owned your decisions. More pie? Vera asked. Yes, Arthur said. The 1966 Gleaner combines ran for 3 more harvest seasons in the Kessler Valley, sometimes on the Meitner farm and sometimes on neighboring farms, on a custom-cut arrangement that was informal and based on neighborly understanding rather than formal contract, which was how most things in the valley worked when they worked best. In 1988, Arthur sold one of the C's to a retired farmer in the Oklahoma Panhandle who had seen it at a local farm show and recognized it as kin to a machine he had run in his working years. The man paid $1,100 for it, which was Arthur's total cost on the machine all told, and Arthur found this perfectly satisfactory. The man shook his hand in the parking lot and looked at the machine on its trailer with the expression of someone being reunited with something they had not known they missed. The second C developed a cracked frame in 1989 and was beyond economical repair. Arthur stripped it for parts. There were a remarkable number of good parts in a machine that had been properly maintained, and sold the remainder to Earl Bodine's salvage yard for the weight of the aluminum, which came to $42. He did not feel sentimental about this. A machine is a tool, and when a tool has done its work, you account for what it gave you and move on. He accounted. The big one. The one he had run himself in the harvest of 1985, and every year after, Arthur kept. He would run it on his own ground for years to come, declining with equal politeness the offers of the equipment dealers who periodically stopped at the farm to offer him trade-in deals on newer machines. The cab was drafty and the seat was his old piece of foam rubber, and it had no stereo and no air conditioning and no digital readouts. And Arthur considered all of this to be entirely beside the point. It started when you turned the key. It cut clean. It put the grain in the hopper and the hopper's grain in the wagon and the wagon's grain in the bin. And that was the definition of what a combine was supposed to do. And the machine did it without complaint and without the need for a specialist, and without a single component that Arthur Meitner could not diagnose, remove, repair, and reinstall with tools that fit in a 5-gallon bucket. The F ran on that farm until Arthur was 69 years old and his sons had taken over the primary management of the operation. On the last morning he ran it himself. He drove it to the south field, the same south field where he had started on the morning of October 8, 1985, and cut the first pass through the soybeans in the early light, and then shut it down and climbed down from the cab and stood beside it for a moment with his hand on the warm aluminum of the body. He could hear Earl Bodine's voice from more than 20 years before. That old F over there. Figure it's worth maybe the scrap value if I'm being generous. He could hear his own voice, telling Dottie, I'll think about it. He could hear the engines of all three machines starting together in the pre-dawn dark of October 1985, and the sound of them running together across the frost-threatened valley, and the sound that the grain made coming up the elevator chain into the hopper. That particular rushing, sliding sound that is one of the most satisfying sounds in all of agriculture, the sound of work being completed, of labor being converted into harvest, of seed becoming food. He patted the side of the machine once. The aluminum rang dully, solidly, the sound of good metal that had been well used and well cared for. And then he turned and walked back across the stubble to where Tommy was waiting with the grain cart. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. And Arthur Meitner had always known that this, too, was a kind of blessing, that the work went on, season to season, and the land kept giving back what you put into it if you treated it right and paid attention and didn't get too far above yourself, and that the machines that served you best were not always the newest or the most expensive or the most impressive to look at from the road, but the ones you understood, the ones you could fix, the ones you could trust when the weather turned and the frost was coming and the banker was sitting in his office with his file folders, counting on the fact that nobody was going to harvest anything this year. His father Gus had known this. His grandfather before that had known it, working behind Ernest and Claude in the first breaking of this ground. And now Jimmy and Tommy knew it too, and someday, not for a while yet, but someday, they would stand beside a machine that looked past its time and see what was really there, and they would remember. The Kessler Valley still produces grain, as it has since before anyone alive can remember. The elevator where Myron Carney weighed in the harvest of 1985 was rebuilt and expanded in 1991. The First National Bank of Coldwater was acquired by a regional bank holding company in 1987, and Gerald Whitfield relocated to Wichita, where he worked in commercial real estate. The Meitner Farm, 320 acres of dark-soiled Kansas ground that Gus Meitner first broke with a two-bottom plow in 1921, is still operated by the Meitner family. The F, the big one, the 1966 Gleaner F that Arthur drove through the frost-threatened harvest of October 1985, sits in the North Machine shed, maintained to running condition, waiting. Old machines don't retire. They wait.